So yeah, moisture cannot be ignored, especially after a hurricane. The goal of this webinar is to raise awareness about how to identify mold and how to deal with it, because it's a fairly serious thing, and the cleanup that's currently going on in Queens and out on Long Island and in some places in Brooklyn, we want to make sure that the homes that are damaged by the hurricane, specifically by water, do not lead to long-term health issues. And we've learned many lessons in the process of making homes energy efficient that apply. You know, if you're tightening up a home to make it more energy efficient and you ignore a moisture issue, it will most certainly turn into a mold issue and may result in a number of health issues for the occupants, from asthma to pulmonary arrest. So we worry about contractors trying to move quickly through storm-ravaged neighborhoods to get things back to normal and possibly leaving a trail of mold issues in their wake. That's essentially what we're doing here. Moisture contributes to 90% of all building material failures, according to ASHRAE, leading cause for building failures in the United States, according to the American Society for Testing of Materials, and the #1 callback on newly constructed homes. Chalking up quite a bit of money every year. So to make this a comprehensive presentation, I'm going to include some information that you probably already know, but them's the breaks. It never hurts to review the basics. Mold is not boring. It's an amazing component of nature, really. It helps to break down organic materials into nutrients that our biosphere needs to complete the life cycle. Microscopic spores that can establish itself in just a few days and release trillions of new spores to complete its own life cycle. Really quite amazing. Spectacular marvel of nature that can also be quite dangerous in certain situations. So as I said, it's pervasive. It's around the world. It's in your backyard in small amounts. Mold is usually very harmless. But when it lands on a damp spot in your home, it can start to grow. And unchecked, it will start to biodegrade the materials that make up the house. Mold grows best in temperatures that we would consider warm. However, some mold species can grow in temperatures as low as 35 degrees Fahrenheit. So all mold needs to grow is a surface to be damp for 24 to 48 hours. If a mold colony's environmental conditions become unfavorable for growth, well, it doesn't really die. The colony just goes to sleep, and it can lay dormant for years until conditions become right again, when it can continue to grow. So this is an issue that we worry about in the wake of Sandy. You dry out the home and you seal up the walls again and you put the new rugs back, but next summer when the humidity is high and the windows are open, moisture can build up to a point where those mold spores will begin to grow again. And so that's why I called this webinar in such a hasty fashion, because I really think it's important to get this information out. Because mold can actually develop sensitivities in people. Usually we say that certain people have sensitivities to mold, and that is correct, but exposure to mold can also compromise the immune system and create permanent sensitivity issues in children and babies and the elderly and the vulnerable. It can turn into asthma, and it can turn into other more serious health problems. And mold symptoms tend to be somewhat unpredictable, so they're hard to diagnose. A couple years ago, I had a friend who started getting headaches every morning when she woke up. And after a while, this kind of morphed into dizziness when she would get out of bed for the first time in the morning. One morning, she literally toppled over and could not gather the energy to stand up. Fairly serious stuff here. Her doctor found nothing wrong with her, and her symptoms were limited to that early morning hour and would go away once she got her first cup of coffee. So it was a big mystery, went on for months, and the doctor's theories were all very scary. And one day, I just suggested kind of off the cuff that maybe we should look for some instance of mold in the bedroom there. And sure enough, on the back of her headboard, there was a mold growing. Not a lot of it, early stage of development, but enough to give her these symptoms. She was fairly sensitive to it. It literally took us 15 minutes to clean it up. We added a dehumidifier for a month just to make sure, and she never had any issues again. So I just worry about all the people who went to the doctor and had all kinds of strange tests, and mold can be dangerous even in very small quantities to some people. So that's why we're talking about this. And then there's the black mold, which can cause serious illness or death amongst people with mold sensitivities. Now, not all mold that appears black is toxic. If you find black mold, which you think might be giving toxic symptoms, then perhaps you'd want to have it tested, but we don't tend to advocate testing very often. We don't care so much what kind of mold it is. All mold needs to be eradicated. We should not be living with it. So, it helps to know what we're up against. So this is kind of the scientific view of it. The first type of mold on this list is the most common. A typical place that you might find this mold growing is in compost or on fallen leaves. It grows well on decaying vegetation. It's an important function in the environment. It can also be found growing inside dirty air conditioners, which is not so important to us, but important to note. The rate of growth can be used to identify this type of mold, with most species growing quite quickly. After 1 week of growth at around 75 degrees, a colony will generally become 1 to 9 centimeters in diameter. So the most dangerous way that mold can infect humans is by forming this fungal ball in the lungs after it infects the lungs and begins to grow. So yes, it sounds disgusting. It is disgusting. A fungal ball that's growing in your lungs. And the health effects can include hearing problems, permanent hearing loss on occasion. In the 1930s, many farm animals in the Ukraine and other parts of Eastern Europe began to die mysteriously. And the symptoms included bleeding, infection, nervous system disorder, and shock. In 1938, Russian scientists discovered that the disease was caused by toxic black mold, which had been growing on the animals' hay and in their feed, which had been wet. And the farmers who were in contact with that grain also became very sick. So it's nothing to play around with. In Cleveland, between 1993 and 1994, there were 30 infants found to have pulmonary hemorrhaging after a large flood, and their homes were flooded. Many of the infants died from lung disease. And later investigation of those homes revealed that it was toxic black mold growing in these houses. So because of its high toxicity, toxic black mold may have even been used as a biological weapon during the Vietnam War. And later on, mycotoxins were used during the Iraq-Iran War, probably by Iraq under Saddam Hussein. It has been proposed that these biological weapons made from toxic black mold may have been the cause of Gulf War syndrome. So black mold is dark, very dark. It's a dark scene. But note that penicillin is a derivative of mold, so there's a silver lining to a very dark cloud there. This list came from Larry Zarker, director of the Building Performance Institute. I'm always ready to plug BPI. When you start the process of rebuilding a home after a flood incident, yes, you'll start by looking for odors. Mold will tell you it's there. Sometimes it's subtle. You should also look for signs that the occupants may be suffering symptoms from mold exposure. Even what seems like a low-grade cold or a low-grade flu may be a reaction to mold, so important to think about that. You would be using a moisture meter to measure the percentage of water in any given substance like wood or sheetrock, or a hygrometer perhaps to determine whether mold may be present or if there is a potential for mold to grow. Very important to note. A psychrometer might be a useful tool to determine relative humidity, which should be kept under 60% to avoid the growth of mold. Mike Dunseth recently reminded me that an infrared camera can be used to identify the potential for mold, or to let you know when it's safe to seal up a wall again, for example, because wood that contains moisture is a different temperature, slightly different temperature than dry wood, and that will show up with an infrared camera. And basic building science reminds us that if there is a mold infestation in the basement of a building and the air ducts aren't sealed, the mycotoxins produced by mold can quickly spread throughout the building. So it's generally important to seal up the supply and return ducts, as we all know, or else a moisture problem in the basement may result in a mold problem somewhere else in the home. Exactly. Thank you, Dolores. So first and foremost, we want to avoid the establishment of mold colonies. The sooner you can dry out a home after flooding, the better. The idea is to minimize mold problems and perhaps even prevent mold from growing at all. That's important. So using things like dehumidifiers, fans, heaters, this helps to dry the house out faster. But first, down there where you are, definitely want to make sure it's safe to use electrical appliances, as the seawater can corrode the outer skin of the wiring, make it very hazardous. If the air outside isn't too humid, then the first step is to just open the windows and ventilate the house. If the carpet got wet, then you need to get rid of it. The padding on the back of the carpet is the problem. It takes a very long time to dry out if it gets saturated, and it will end up smelling bad, and it will lead to mold growth. Very difficult to dry that out. We really worry about mold starting to grow inside the wall cavities of rooms that were flooded. So, if a room with drywall was flooded, you're going to need to cut away the bottom section of that drywall at least 12 inches above where it got wet. Other porous building materials that also got wet, such as wall paneling, those are going to have to be removed too. Wood which got wet could be all right to keep once it's dried out, as long as there's no mold growing on it. But if mold has been there for a while, started to embed itself into the fibers, then really the only thing you can do is to sand these areas of the wood. Like carpet, insulation also takes too long to dry out. So you're going to have to throw away any insulation that got wet during the flood. And yes, this is a big deal here.